was the full service. So that's the housekeeping that I have for today. Getting down to the sermon for this week. As you may know, the last week, I believe it was last week, was what we call Mental Awareness Week. And a few years ago, a couple of doctors in the community started what was called Mental Awareness Shabbat, where they asked rabbis particularly to speak on the subject. It's not an easy subject to speak on, and in sort of previous years I've scouted the subject because it's not something that I really feel I'm knowledgeable enough to speak about. But this year in particular has been a tough year when it comes to mental awareness, and because of things that have gone on in the certainly in my daily life serving the community, I decided to try to bring a perspective to it. And I believe that it's very apt that it's actually Parshat Kedoshim where it comes out. Because this week, when we read Parshat Kedoshim, if you look at the Torah reading itself, it contains very little narrative and makes up a portion of the section of the Torah which is known as the Holiness Code. And it begins with the instruction to the Israelites, Kedoshim tihiyu li. Now, listen to the word carefully, tihiyu. Kedoshim tihiyu, holy you shall be, but tihiyu is written in the plural, not in the singular, which we'll come to a little bit later. Kedoshim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem, you shall be holy, for I, your God, am holy. Okay? Statement, nothing wrong with that. The portion then instructs us exactly how to be holy, with ritual, ethical imperatives such as do not curse the deaf, do not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, or a stranger that lives with you shall be as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, of course, there are very many verses focusing on ritual parts, Jewish practices as well, what we're supposed to do, what we're not supposed to do, how we're supposed to do it. But what's very notable is that so much of what makes up the holy code is care for others, especially those who are vulnerable, the blind, the deaf, the indigent, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. But when you look at it very carefully, you notice one class of vulnerable people doesn't seem to be mentioned, and that is the mentally ill. While we don't see mental illness specifically mentioned among the usual classes of the vulnerable, there are many mentions in our tradition of people who struggle with their mental health, be it bipolar, depression, dementia, Alzheimer's, suicidal tendencies. Tehillim are full of descriptions that are clearly a person who is struggling with depression. I'm going to share a few verses. Tehillim says, Ki shava b'ra'os nafshi v'chai lishol higio. For I am satiated with misfortune, and I'm on the brink of Sheol. O nechshavti miyordei vo hayisi kegeva ayin avel. I am numbered with those who go down to the pit. I'm helpless. I can't do anything. Abandoned among the dead, like bodies lying in the grave of whom you are mindful. No more. Cut off from your care. You know, the sages in the Talmud discuss how to deal with depression. They understood depression back then, in the 2nd century, the 3rd century. The Gemara expands, the Talmud expands on a verse from Proverbs. It says, Daga belev ish yashchenu. If there is a care in a man's heart, obviously we're talking here about a heaviness, then let him quash it. Let him quash it. The Talmud notes that Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi dispute the verse's meaning. One said he should forcefully push it out of his mind, stop thinking about it. One who worries should banish his concerns from his thoughts. And one said it means that he should, yeshena, means he should tell others his concerns, and that will lower his anxiety. I don't know if they had psychologists or psychotherapists in those days, but maybe he was alluding, Rabbi Asi was alluding to that. Saying all that, the dichotomy of the Talmud echoes the communal response we still seem to have today. Many in society still try to ignore the mental health crisis that has been on us for a long time, but which, in the wake of the isolation through the pandemic, has only gotten a lot worse. Furthermore, the continued use of what I call the old Jewish threat myths. For instance, one, I'm sure you've heard it, "Hey, if you commit suicide, you can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery." It's nonsense. Absolute nonsense. No way true. It demonstrates an ignorance among the people towards the very real crisis of mental epidemic which we are in and in our community. There is plenty, I'm sure you've seen it, there's plenty of internet meme advice for those who are struggling with depression or any form of mental illness. You can read it. "Oh, just cheer up. If you really work at it, you'll be fine. Go for a walk. It will get the air into you and you'll feel much better. Exercise, go to the gym. If you exercise on the treadmill for 45 minutes a day, it's gone. Or better still, do yoga. Yoga's going to get rid of all the depression. And if you can do hot yoga, well, that gets rid of everything." Unfortunately, for all the advice, this increases the isolation of the sufferer, and it does not address the underlying problem. There is still so much stigma attached to mental illness that people try to cover it up or they try to ignore it. But Rabbi Asi offers a very different and I think a better model. What does he say? And this going back to the 2nd century, so he was really ahead of his time. He said, "Tell others your concern." In other words, speak about it. Get it out there. But for that to work, we need to remove the stigma. And there is a huge stigma still today. You know, just this past week, we learned that the country star Naomi Judd lost her life to mental illness. Depression and other forms of mental illness is a crisis. According to NAMI, which is the National Alliance of Mental Illness, 1 in 5 in North America, we're talking about adults here, have experienced a mental illness. More than 12 million have had serious thoughts of suicide. And yet the average interval between the onset of symptoms and treatment is a whopping 11 years. 11 years. It is shocking to realize that so many people are affected by mental illness, and yet it is so difficult to get treatment due to the difficulty of accessing services. The lack of inclusion of mental health as part of mental health plans, and of course due to the stigma of admitting that one has a mental illness in the first place. You try getting mental help here in Montreal. I'm not talking about initial, because that you can get initial, but long term. You can forget about it. There are members of our community who have been diagnosed with mental illness. They are embarrassed. They try to hide it. They try to cover it up. They don't want to speak about it. They don't want to tell family and friends, so they tend to stay away. And so the isolation continues. And rather than speaking up, making people aware, not for the pity purpose, but for the understanding of why you are acting the way you are. Just prior to Passover, I officiated the funeral of a young man, recently arrived in Canada, who lost his life to mental illness for the sole reason that he had no access to the medication that he needed during his waiting time for the access for the RAMQ system to kick in. So 90 days. And after a month of being off his meds due to their inaffordability in the private sector and no way to refill while waiting for the RAMQ to click in, from no fault of his own, totally out of his control, he lost his life. At 41, he left a young wife and a young 9-year-old daughter. There is an episode in the Talmud in which Rabbi Yochanan falls ill. And Rabbi Hanina came to visit him. And he says to him, "Is your suffering dear to you?" And Rabbi Yochanan responded, "I welcome neither the suffering nor its reward." And Rabbi Hanina said to him, "Give me your hand." And he gave him his hand, and Rabbi Hanina stood him and restored him to health. So the Gemara has to ask the question, why did Rabbi Yochanan wait for Rabbi Hanina to restore him to health? If he was able to be healed by a student, why didn't Rabbi Yochanan do it himself? Just get up and start moving around and get healthy again. And the Talmud provides its own answer. And the answer it provides is because a prisoner cannot generally free themselves from prison. Kedoshim tihiyu, as I said to you in the beginning, the word tihiyu is not in the singular, but is in the plural, telling us that when a person suffers, it is the responsibility of the community to help them with their suffering, because a prisoner cannot release themselves from prison. To do this, we must begin by both destigmatizing mental illness, but also by making sure that it is no longer invisible. My own niece, who suffers from depression, posted the following on Facebook just a few days ago. "Even though my illness is labeled invisible, if you look closely, you will find nothing invisible about it. You say I'm invisible, but can't you see how much my life has changed? No more school, no more work, no more socializing. You say I'm invisible, but can't you see how it affects my family, my full-time career, canceled holidays, the worry in their eyes? You say I'm invisible, but can't you see the pain I'm in? The leaving early, the canceled last minute, that you haven't heard from me because I did a thing yesterday. You say I'm invisible, that you can't see me. Come look a bit closer. You'll see me. You'll see the pain. You'll see the life change. You'll see the effort to look normal. You'll see the loneliness. You'll see the grief. You'll see the sadness, the frustration. And you'll see the ripple effect that the illness has had on my life and those I love. And then you'll see a fighter. You'll see someone trying hard, desperately hard to get better. You'll see the daily acceptance, surrendering and letting go. You'll see the extra love that I'm pouring into my body and soul, reminding myself it's going to be okay. You'll see the unrelenting resilience, courage, and bravo it takes to get me through each day. Come and look around me too. You'll see the other warriors, the healers, and just trying to get buyers like me out there. Why can't you see? Why can't you see me? Why can't you see me? Do you see me now? I remember growing up in London in a very tight what we call mitnagdisha community. And I remember that in our community, you could never, ever say the C word. The C word was considered a no-go. Why? Because it had a stigma attached to it. What am I referring to? The C word, cancer. If somebody had cancer, it was say nothing. It was though death was automatically on the doorsteps and it would bring bad luck. The person who had cancer was considered a nebuch. Oh, he says a nebuch. It took decades for cancer to be recognized as an illness that people lived with and didn't necessarily die from. Well, I'm telling you that the time has come for us to embrace mental awareness in all its forms as another illness that needs our unequivocal attention and full attention. It's nobody's fault that they have mental illness, and just like it's not their fault if they have cancer. So on this Shabbos, we pray that those suffering speak out so that we can be there to help you. And if not, we're going to be there anyway to help you. Shabbat Shalom.